What's up, everybody? This is Shane from Ferocious Fatherhood here doing another 30 for 30. Today, I got Pierre Zam with me. He is a board certified psychiatrist based out of Florida and the owner of Braver Man. Pierre, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you for having me,
Yeah,
Shane.
man,
I appreciate you.
yeah, absolutely, dude. I'm super excited to have you on. I'm super excited to dig into the mental health aspect of fathers and men because I it definitely doesn't get talked about enough. And
Yeah,
the more talks I'm having with other men, the more I'm realizing like, hey, this stuff isn't out there. So I love the fact that you're putting this stuff out there. I want to say thank you for doing that.
of
And
course.
yeah, just take a minute, introduce yourself and what Braver Man is, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist by training. I've been in the practice of psychiatry for about 15 years before I became really interested in working with men at times of big change. Initially, that was early fatherhood, and have worked in or worked to sort of meld traditional mental health care with and awareness around mental health care with professional coaching. And so I started Braverman about 4 years ago now as a platform for working with men one on one around navigating major life and career changes. Again, initially that was really geared toward new fathers and early fatherhood. And also, it has become for me a platform for raising awareness for matters related to men's mental health at large. A big chunk of that is around times of transition, and a big chunk of that is around fathers. A big part of my professional work remains building and raising awareness to mental health needs and services in early fatherhood. And so I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be here and to be talking about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that we got to be talking more about it. I know
Yeah.
when I first had my kids, there was no talk about it. There was no hey, this is kind of what to expect. You know, you see it a lot with like the new moms, and I know my there's some material out there for like my wife. But man, I really didn't see it with dads.
Yeah. There has historically not been much. I think that there has been some increase, but still not nearly enough
Hmm.
discussion around mental health, particularly for new
Hmm.
fathers.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's not. We definitely got to get out there talking more.
Yeah, for sure.
So, kind of like, what were some when you were growing up? So, what was your background like? Was your father kind of in your life? You know, what kind of started like the basics there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, he he was and is, and I think had his own experiences of struggles that were probably not brought to anyone's attention. I think he would probably uh, admit that um, he struggled through parts of being a father, navigating who he is and his identity outside of fatherhood with um, being a family man. And he's
Mhm.
a really strong, uh, very hard worker who um, I think would give you the shirt off his back, but also work to the bone. Um, and sort of struggled to be uh, as present as he could. I think he would acknowledge that even now.
Wow, that's yeah, that's awesome that he's willing to acknowledge that.
Hmm.
That's not something that's common. It's not something that's common among men. I know, like
Yeah,
you know, when my son was born, definitely a struggle I went through. I wasn't really willing to talk about. So that's awesome that he's definitely willing to.
yeah, Yeah, he's not one to commonly share his experience. On occasion he will shed some light on that. And it's rare, but when it happens it's a little bit of a window into his own experience.
Hmm.
But I think you're right. I think it's a rarity to be able to acknowledge that. And I don't know, looking back, that he would have been able to acknowledge it then. But I think there are times when he recognizes it now.
Hmm.
Um, and, our relationship was um, sort of a strained one throughout at various times, I would say.
Hmm.
Um, so I appreciate the just even his his trying to come to terms with who he is personally, with who he is as a father. I think that's probably a big challenge. This matter of identity, it's a big challenge for many men, particularly in the early stages of fatherhood, but throughout the experience of fatherhood. It is one of the most exciting and also challenging times from the standpoint of defining a man's identity. And I think that's a big part of what initially drew me to working with new dads.
Hmm.
But looking back at my dad's own experience, I can appreciate how that fit into to his life as well.
Hmm. What do you think are like some of the biggest challenges that new dads face? Like, why is it so hard for new dads to kind of open up and talk?
Yeah, well, I think this is an important question, perhaps to ask of men at large, which is that many men face a lot of expectation for how we ought to show up. And much of that is based on very traditional ideas and norms that
Hmm.
may not always be very realistic. To fully show up as self sufficient, not needing help, invulnerable, strong, stoic, essentially to have it all figured out is kind of an unreasonable expectation for anyone.
Absolutely.
And I'd say at a point of major vulnerability where your entire life shifts, your perspective naturally has to shift, and your priorities shift, those expectations can come to the fore as pretty harsh when it comes to feeling vulnerable. You naturally, as a human taking care of um, a baby, building a family, are going to hit moments of vulnerability where you don't have it all figured out,
Mm.
where you do need help, where you don't feel so strong or so competent, um, where you do experience anxiety or fear that challenge some of the traditional norms around masculinity. And I think for that reason, it becomes an important time for men from a mental health standpoint. It becomes an important time of vulnerability, but also a potential time for immense opportunity in terms of defining or redefining your sense of identity and building connection within your family and within your community. Unfortunately, I think it's often that many men are isolated, that isolation is endemic to men.
Hmm.
And that's certainly true for fathers. And so, one of the biggest challenges, I'd say, for many men is feeling connected, both within the realm of their families, but also within the realm of um, their own sort of personal
Hmm.
community, feeling connected to other people who have our back is pretty rare, unfortunately, for men, at least beyond a relatively shallow level of connection. I think most men are really seeking uh, a more authentic, meaningful connection, but not having it. And I think it becomes particularly challenging around early fatherhood when men are also facing big challenges, big strains on time.
Yeah, I do think that's real. I know that loss of identity, man, that hits you. That can hit you hard because all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're going from, if you're married, you and your wife kind of doing whatever you want. It's easy. You all go out to dinner when you want, things like that. Date however you want, and then to have, just all of that just changed. And now, I remember like with our first kid, it was we would maybe get every 3 4 months an opportunity to ourselves,
Yeah.
and to take that opportunity for, if I wanted to take an opportunity for myself, it was even less. And that's a hard transition. It's a hard
Yeah.
transition to go
It is a
from
very
that
hard
to,
transition.
yeah, it's almost like hitting a wall,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. I think that's a common one for many men, especially early on in fatherhood. A big area of strain is around a change in self identity, a
Mhm.
change in the way I might see myself and see myself engaging with other people outside of the context of fatherhood.
Mhm.
So I'm really appreciative that you bring it to the fore in terms of conversation here. It's an astoundingly important part of becoming a father.
Mhm. How has the so I know, do you hear this a lot with guys that are, new dads, that making that shift of just your entire life changes. You're no longer working out the way you want to. You're no longer hanging out with your friends. Is that kind of one of the bigger things that weighs on new dads?
Yeah, it is. I think it's one of the things that kind of catches men's attention. But it's just sort of one of the sets of experiences that probably speak to something that changes that's a bit deeper for most guys, which is this question of now who am I and where am I in my life? Where am I moving forward? And I think it sort of touches on the surface of men's experiences. I'm not hanging out with my friends anymore. I'm not able to engage in um, the same type of
Mhm.
everyday activity that I might have been before. My relationship changes, my sleep changes, my diet and nutrition change. Um, there's big shifts and changes. Yes, I think that they're markers of a bigger fundamental shift for many guys, um, which is almost a change in reason for being. What are my priorities in life? They've shifted pretty dramatically. And
Mhm.
it becomes a time for revisiting or potentially visiting for the very first time what's important to me, which I think
Mhm.
is a big reason why I personally was drawn to working with men at times of new or early fatherhood, because it is a time of reflection and trying to identify what's actually important to me and how to juggle all of these different things when there's a new priority in my life that maybe I've never experienced before.
Mhm.
I'd say that's probably true even for repeat dads. I think that's really true and for various reasons. The sort of first time fatherhood is a a relatively large transition as compared to repeat fatherhood, but I don't think that it's necessarily an easy transition for any man each time.
Hmm.
And so uh, each experience of expanding a family becomes a new time for reflection, a new time for navigating some major changes in terms of what's important to me.
Hmm.
How do I navigate my relationship with my partner? What does it mean to have, you know, a growing family?
Hmm.
How do I navigate my own personal needs? How do I navigate my career in the context of an expanding family? Many of those come to the fore for men at the time of fatherhood. And I think they're often the source of angst. I'd say there are lots of potential causes for mental health changes in fatherhood. That just scratches the surface.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it definitely does. I know that when you were talking, kind of what you said a couple minutes ago, the even the shift from one to two kids was, I mean, for us, it meant that I pushed myself even kind of further back.
Hmm.
Um, do you see that a lot? Do you see like the more, I don't want to say like the more kids people have, the less they take care of themselves, but do they kind of push themselves to the background more and their family
Mm.
forwards? I
Oh,
mean,
that's a great question. I don't know that I've seen anything consistently from one dad to the next.
okay.
Um, but I do think there are dynamics that show up at various stages of life that maybe related to the kind of the number of kids a man has, or the sort of the expansion of a family. But it does feel like there are some common themes that come up over and over, regardless of uh, whether it's kid one or kid two or three or so on. Uh, but also, in between, life is changing. Your career
Mhm.
is changing. You're getting some miles under your belt in terms of age and priority. Your relationship with your wife or your girlfriend or your partner is changing, and so each time can be a little bit different. I think that's true in terms of the mental health experience, where there's almost an expectation that the first kid is going to be the most challenging in terms of the mental health experience. And there's almost, I sometimes will hear this from men. There's almost this expectation that, I've done this before. It's not my first rodeo, that
Mhm. Mhm.
I, uh, that I shouldn't be experiencing the stress or the strain of a third child, for example, when I've already had two.
Mhm.
But that's not generally the way in which mental health experiences will work. In many cases, there are very stereotypic experiences that are associated uh, with fatherhood or with stressful events that will increase the likelihood for experiencing something like a depressive episode or anxiety each time that a kid comes around, even if you've done it before,
Mhm.
which I think becomes an important thing for men to recognize, because there is often a sense of personal shame that comes about when we experience, even if we put the sort of the construct of fatherhood aside, there is a sense of personal shame that comes about for many men who experience, and I've experienced it myself in the context of uh, depressive episodes in the past, of feeling like we shouldn't experience, and I'm using air quotes here, that we somehow shouldn't
Mhm.
experience a an episode of depression or bad anxiety, panic attacks, because we should, and again in quotes, have it all figured out. And that's certainly not the way our brains work. Our
Hmm.
experiences of mental health and certainly around mental illness have nothing to do with our strength or our weakness as humans or our value as humans. We're all susceptible to the experience of mental illness and certainly to the ups and downs of mental health.
Hmm.
And so I'd say there's a big part for many fathers of feeling the need to focus our attention on the welfare, the well being of our families, the well being of a kid.
Hmm.
And so there can be a tremendous amount of guilt or even shame around experiencing something like depression or anxiety in the postpartum period, which only exacerbates the likelihood of withholding, not sharing with other people, not bringing it to the fore, not seeking help.
Hmm.
And so I think it becomes really important to name that for many fathers, to name that for many men, that there are many of us in the world who experience mental health conditions like depression or anxiety or PTSD or OCD, that the time of early fatherhood, even if you view fatherhood as a positive experience, and most men do, remains a time of risk for mental health conditions. It almost sort of takes away some of the sense of me being or any man being responsible for bringing on something like depression or anxiety,
Hmm.
which is a big fallacy that can propagate a sense of shame around something that is fully out of our control.
Yeah, that's so. I'm glad that you kind of brought this up. That
Yeah.
postpartum in dads. I mean, how real is that? How like many men face that? Because that's that postpartum. I mean, I know that with women, and like I said, my wife had some not some interaction beforehand before we had our kids, and they said, look, like this might happen. You might feel this way. But how
Yep.
common is that in men? And like, what does that look like in men? Because I don't even know if I could identify what that would look like in a male because I mean, we just don't talk about it.
Yeah, we don't really. I mean, the the risk for postpartum anxiety or depression is very real in men. So about 1 in 10 men will experience postpartum depression in the first year after birth.
Mm-hmm.
And postpartum anxiety is a little bit harder to pinpoint in part because we'll often use the term postpartum anxiety to cover a number of different syndromes like panic attacks or generalized anxiety or PTSD or OCD even. And so the rates for postpartum anxiety for men are somewhere between 5% and 20% of men.
Okay.
The most recent studies suggest that rate is probably about 10%. So it's quite similar for both postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression. There's a lot of overlap between the two in terms of the potential to have elements of both. If we talk just about the depressive piece, now we're talking about essentially the experience of major depression in the first year postpartum. So during pregnancy or in the first year postpartum. And usually we think about major depression as a 2 week stretch of a combination of symptoms, including depressed or low mood, changes to interest or loss of joy, loss of interest in things that might normally bring you joy, alongside changes to sleep and energy and concentration and appetite, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, hopelessness or even suicidal thinking, sluggishness or restlessness. Now, the challenge is generally in men. I mean, again, even if we look at men outside of the realm of the postpartum period, that many guys will experience elements of depression that don't necessarily match the textbook.
Mhm.
Many guys won't describe feeling sad. Will often describe feeling fatigued, feeling tired, feeling drained, which is obviously kind of difficult to identify in relation to early fatherhood. But many men will describe feeling irritable or restless, experiencing attacks of anxiety, of anger, or
Mhm.
lashing out, being very indecisive, or having a change to um, a sense of self assuredness. Many guys will also turn to alcohol or other substances or even risky sex or gambling as kind of a way to escape or to numb.
Mhm.
And so, for most new fathers who experience postpartum depression, that will show up, or the height of the the risk for men seems to be in months 3 to 6 postpartum. There's a lot
Oh,
of
wow. Okay.
um, potential reasons for that, in part potentially um, related to change in responsibility around maternal leaves. But there's also changes that naturally happen um, around hormone levels for men as well as that mirror
Mm.
the experiences for mom, that are in large part designed for increasing baby bonding. So, drops in testosterone, changes to estrogen and cortisol, changes to oxytocin, essentially efforts to almost evolutionarily enhance baby bonding might also play into the risk for experiencing depression. So there are lots of different factors at play. Obviously, the factors associated with a change to self identity, a change to
Mhm.
everyday sort of schedule, changes to sleep, changes to intimacy with your partner, um, changes. We add on top of that kind of a change to your hormone levels and and also just this immense sort of restructuring of priorities within your life. So all of these things are happening at once and increase the likelihood for the onset of major depression during that first year period postpartum. And so for many men that can look like several weeks, although I'd say for most people who experience episodes of depression, that's along the order of several months of feeling lower than normal, of perhaps being more irritable and angry, even lashing out in attacks of anger, of feeling less self assured, less decisive, having trouble with things like concentration and appetite and energy and motivation, feeling guilty or hopeless, potentially even seeking out substances or other ways to numb.
Mm.
That's a general sort of encapsulates a number of the experiences for men who face postpartum depression.
Mhm.
Postpartum anxiety can look in all sorts of ways and can overlap pretty strongly with depression as well. And I'm happy to
Wow.
go into that if that's something that that might be valuable too.
Yeah, it definitely will be. I do want to kind of hit on. I'm kind of surprised
Yeah,
the 3 to 6 month period is more of where it kind of really hits. I guess that I would think that it would happen kind of initially. I
yeah,
know when I don't know what the statistics are for women in postpartum, but I know like when we initially came home with my first son, my wife kind of had like an issue of like, okay, I have to make sure the stove's always turned off, checking it two, three
yep, yep,
times, microwave, clothes, kind of like little things like that, especially when we would go for a drive. And so I guess on the men's side, I'm kind of surprised that we don't have that it maybe occurs a little later. But I guess that kind of makes sense because if you bring a newborn home, that first little bit, it's exciting, it's fun. I know, I got 6 weeks off of work. So that
yeah,
initial 6 weeks was, I mean, yeah, you're up throughout the night, but then you sleep till 10, 11 o'clock during the day. So
sure.
then like that 3 month mark, I guess makes sense because now people, the dad's back to work, maybe the mom's back to work, you know,
Yep.
life is nowhere near you. You're babysit, finding babysitters, things like that. So that's really interesting that you kind of brought that up, that it's that 3 to 6 month mark.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting finding. And I would say, Shane, one of the important things to note here is that paternal patterns of postpartum depression and anxiety are still being, they're still kind of in their infancy of study.
Mhm.
And so I think those of us who find this really important to, to share bits of information and knowledge and awareness still rely on a growing body of work to describe these experiences, but it's still there's still a lot to be done in terms of understanding perhaps some of the contributors to why we see these patterns. I think there are a number of them. Uh, I think Shane, you hit on an important one, which is the potential contribution of uh, maternal and paternal leave.
Mhm.
And so that's quite variable. Be interesting to see if that impacts the way and the onset of depression for men. It tends to show up a little bit earlier for moms. And I would say I actually I mean there's a lot of questioning around leaves as and changes to responsibility as a potential reason for why we're seeing this sort of peak a little bit
Mhm.
later than we might expect. And we don't see that actually for anxiety. In fact, we see patterns of anxiety tend to peak very early on, late pregnancy and early. And that sort of makes sense. In some ways, there are natural fears that might emerge, particularly around the safety of a baby
Mhm.
and the safety of mom, the well being of mom. This is particularly a challenge for fathers whose partners faced a traumatic birth.
Mhm.
So early on, there might be lots of fear and anxiety associated with the safety of mom and the safety of baby. And that tends to attenuate, tends to gradually get a little better as you get more and more practice and more experience, ensuring that the safety of the baby is in check. Now,
Mhm.
certainly there are situations with anxiety conditions that will persist. And again, about 10% of guys will experience a syndromal anxiety in the postpartum period in the first year. Whether that look like excessive worry or panic attacks or really bad social anxiety or flashbacks or a PTSD type of experience, or an OCD kind of experience where there are intense patterns of intrusive thoughts, particularly around the safety of the baby, even thoughts of concern that I might inadvertently harm the baby.
Hmm.
That's really common. We know that it impacts about 85% of dads and about 95% of moms, these sort of intrusive thoughts. They may not necessarily be persistent or pervasive, but we know about, again, about 10% of dads and about 20% of moms will experience a syndromal anxiety, and often that includes intrusive thoughts
Hmm.
that are more recurrent. But again, important to note that at least with the depressive experience and that peak, I think that there's more to it than meets the eye. I think one of the things that, at least, and again, this is largely anecdotal, partly based on uh, lots of research that has suggested this for men at large. I think what often happens with dads is that the experience of depression in general tends to be pretty insidious. It's slow. It happens really gradually. It's not an immediate on or off because there's not an awareness to it. There isn't a sense that maybe I might be more vulnerable in the way that we have raised at least enough awareness for moms to say, well, I've got to be on the lookout for postpartum depression.
Hmm.
We don't have that really for dads as of yet. It's not so commonly recognized that, families or doctors or people who are looking after dads are saying, are you okay, or you having any of these symptoms? There's really not a mechanism for screening. And so what I think happens is that that these syndromes like depression might start a whole lot earlier than they're identified in fathers. And so it may take months of the experience brewing before it comes to the fore, before it's even recognized in fathers. And so a limited amount of research will suggest then that the 3 to 6 month period is the peak of the incidence of depression. But we don't actually know if, in fact, men were suffering from depressive symptoms earlier on and didn't know that what they were experiencing was depression. No one knew around them to look for depression. And so it may have simmered before coming to the awareness of
Hmm.
anyone, including the man himself.
Hmm.
So that may explain some of the discrepancy there too. It's really hard to tell. There's no tried or true here. I would say that the first year, research suggests that the first year is just a heightened time of risk
Hmm.
for men, and so it's important to sort of recognize that this is a possibility, increase awareness, and increase the screening, increase the awareness of people around dads to ask, hey, are you okay? Do you need support? Are you experiencing any of this stuff? We know it's, again, tied to an extreme amount of shame. Doesn't need to be, but a
Hmm.
lot of the norms around masculinity, uh, around a lot of the very traditional norms around masculinity, will tell us we've got to have it all figured out. And so lots of men are going to be reluctant to voice the need for help.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so it
that's
becomes really important for us to recognize how we can support dads
hmm
from the outside looking in.
hmm yeah, that's a really interesting point. And you and I were talking earlier, is that when my wife, before we even had our kid, my wife was already like getting resources from doctors, like appointments. I want to say like 3 or 4 months just into being pregnant. Like, hey, here's some postpartum stuff. Here's what you might be facing, and it continued to happen. And I mean, you're right. I never was never once asked, and I'm not saying this is like a dig or anything, but I never had anybody say, "Hey, what do you think you're going to go through? This is what you might face. This is that's
Yeah.
a I do think that's really necessary for us to get out there and start saying, "Hey,
Well,
you're going to experience this."
yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think this is where there's a lot of work to be done within the medical community. And
Mhm.
certainly it was, and I'll acknowledge this, it's a little embarrassing to acknowledge, but it was definitely, I don't know, 10 years into practice before I knew that the first year was a time of risk for fathers, that postpartum depression was even a thing.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of work to be done from the standpoint of supporting fathers. It's important to note, and I think always worth noting here, Shane, there's a lot of work to be done supporting moms as well.
Mhm.
I think we're lagging on the support for parents at large, and certainly for screening around postpartum mental health conditions in all parents. And I think it's worth noting because often there's this sense or fear, or maybe sort of unwarranted kind of a sense of competition, that if we turn more attention to dads, then will we be detracting or deterring attention from moms who, quite honestly, need as much support as we can give,
Mhm.
and need more support than at least the medical
Mhm.
community has, can perhaps can provide.
Yeah.
Reality here is it's not a zero sum game. And the more we support one parent, and this is true, I would say, regardless of whether parents are together in a primary relationship, the more we support one parent, the more we support the family at
Mhm.
large, the more we support both parents and the kid. And so we know that the mental health and well-being of each parent is protective to the kid and protective to the other parent potentially.
Mhm.
And so it is important that we recognize turning attention to both fathers and
Yeah.
mothers is valuable to the kid, is valuable to each parent, is valuable to the family unit,
Mhm.
no matter what that family unit looks like.
Mhm. Yeah, I do agree with that. It's not when you're trying to help one, you're not. I mean, you help the whole family.
Yeah,
You
for sure.
help one, and you can help alleviate maybe some source here, which then funnels down into some source of controversy here within the family, and you can really help. I really think that we need to be coming together to build both fathers and mothers up. Like ferocious fatherhood, I don't believe it's just a fatherhood only. I believe that we have to be partnering with mothers. You just have to be. Is there
Yeah.
so one of the questions I'm kind of interested in, is there a correlation between the um, postpartum anxiety or postpartum depression in men and whether or not they are married or single? Is there like a higher increase in married men or single men, or is there not really a correlation at all?
Hmm. That's a great question. I think one of the things that has been shown to be a risk factor for postpartum depression is relationship strain. And so it's interesting because that could be seen in different ways. It could be a relationship that is technically together, but somehow strained,
Hmm.
as opposed to a relationship that is not primary, essentially, where mom and dad or both parents are not together, but quite amicable. And so, if we make the assumption that, and I would say it's perhaps too big an assumption to make, to suggest that then single dads might be at greater risk. But
Hmm.
we do know that relationship strain, a lack of social supports, being limited from baby bonding increases risk. And so I would say that that single men, single fathers may have more of those risk factors. Doesn't mean that they're sort of uh, that being a single father will innately put you at risk to not have, or will innately mean that you don't have enough time with your baby, that your relationship with mom is strained, and that your social supports are fewer. But it does mean that that if those are the case for single men, that they may be at higher risk for experiencing depression. The same is true for married or partnered men. Those risk factors are true there as well. So being not having as many social supports, being excluded from baby bonding, and having strain in your primary relationship,
Mhm.
all of those are risk factors for postpartum depression. And suppose you could look at it as being potentially impactful for men, regardless of whether they're technically single or partnered.
Right.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
do
man.
know one thing that is perhaps the biggest risk factor for postpartum depression in men, and that is the experience of postpartum depression in mom, which
Mm.
is really important. Um, and and I think it'd be important to also take a look at the reverse here. But the the latest studies suggest that if mom experiences postpartum depression, then dad's risk or goes up. Essentially, that and it's hard to tell exactly what sort of how the sort of causation here works. I don't think that we can suggest that one causes the other, but if mom is experiencing postpartum depression, then the likelihood of dad having postpartum depression is about 25 to 50%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so, really substantial,
Hmm.
which means that uh, if one parent is experiencing postpartum depression, we really need to ensure some screening and proper services for the other parent.
Hmm.
We don't know or at least I don't know, if there's been any evidence to show the the exact reverse. If dad is experiencing postpartum depression, what's the likelihood of mom? I would
Mm.
suspect that it's actually higher.
Mm.
That most moms, that in this case, more moms than not, whose male partner experiences postpartum depression, either has or had experienced postpartum depression as well. So
Wow.
again, it adds to this complexity around ensuring that we're turning attention to to all parents
Hmm.
in the process of ensuring the wellness of a family.
Hmm. Yeah. So what does that look like in terms of providing support? How can what's the best way that you've seen for peers to provide support? I mean, obviously, I have no training in this. So
Yeah.
what are some best ways that, like, hey, if my friend is experiencing something, I can help them? Is there like a I don't want to say like the core pillars, but is there almost like, hey, these things tend to work better, or getting them out, getting them just providing support? Is there
Yeah. Well, you know, there's there's a lot to that question. I mean, I think in terms of providing mental health services uh, generally, that is, it feels like that's a limited scope around the support.
Mhm.
Like there aren't enough mental health services for new fathers. We know that. Fortunately, it's something that's expanding, and it's an area of increased research and increased clinical services. It still lags the sheer number of fathers who need the help. The same is true for moms. in terms of supporting your fellow man who might be experiencing depression, um, the I think reaching out alone is a big one. Reaching out in suspending judgment, increasing the likelihood that a man is going to share his own experience with you. Um, that often comes from not trying to fix or not trying to tell a man how to do something, but being more inquisitive, being more curious, helping a man to appreciate that I'm here, that you can reach out to talk. I won't try to necessarily tell you what to do or try to fix it for you, but it's important for you to know that I'm here.
Mhm.
I also know, um, this is a time of big change for you. And so it's important for you to know that if you don't have it all figured out, it's okay.
Mhm.
That I'm not going to judge you. And also, I'm going to try to be as supportive as possible um, you know, without necessarily telling you what to do, which I
Mhm.
think is a hard thing for many guys. We want to help people as much as we can in the moment. That means often that we're giving advice or that we're trying to fix it for another guy. Often, and I find this to be is sort of interesting because Shane, I mean, you reached out to me and my first response was, I'm not a dad, but there is a sense actually that in some ways my not being a dad has protected me um, from something that maybe all or at least most men tend to or practice that most of us tend to engage in, which is to give our own experience of a particular situation,
Mhm.
uh, to try to share or impart wisdom or to give advice based on our own stuff.
Mhm.
In a lot of ways, not having gone through fatherhood also means that while I might be well versed in the experiences of men who are going through fatherhood, um, I'm not in a position to try to fix, advise, course correct on the part of another man.
Mhm.
So there's a part of me that would want to say here to maybe take that on, to take on a more curious approach where instead of giving your own advice based on your experience of your journey of fatherhood, that you're asking more questions.
Mhm.
What is this like for you? What's that experience been? Um, how has it been to transition into fatherhood? What have been the hardest parts? What have been the best parts? What support might you need? I think there's more value here to men asking questions rather than giving advice or trying to fix
Mhm.
um, based on your own experience.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I've realized that the best way that I can help, is being curious, not judgmental. That's
Yeah.
really what I've learned for myself. Hey man,
Yeah.
this talk has been absolutely awesome. I love it. I do got kind of start wrapping it up, man. But
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Of course.
but but please take an opportunity, let everyone know how to get a
Yeah.
hold of you, and give a little spiel, man.
Sure. Yeah. I appreciate that. So I am most easily reachable through, and probably the biggest platform that I've used to raise awareness to topics related to men's mental health has been through Instagram. And on that platform, my handle's at braver.man. And really, again, a forum that's used for one on one work with men at times a big career and personal transition. A big part of that is early fatherhood. But it's also a platform for raising awareness and advocacy around topics related to men's mental health, topics like depression and anxiety, topics that extend beyond just mental illness to things like self-doubt and building confidence and being a man of heart, helping other men, showing support for men who might be at risk, building awareness to topics like self-harm, like suicide, topics that are less often discussed, like men's experiences of OCD and trauma and PTSD, but certainly a slew of topics related to early fatherhood. And I think an area of, for me, growing interest in helping men to transition into fatherhood, but also to navigate the many sort of developmental milestones of fatherhood. We talk a lot about the early experiences, but fatherhood is for many men
Ever.
it's a
Yeah,
lifetime
forever. Yeah.
experience. It's a
Yep.
huge and important one.
Hmm.
So easiest way to find me is Instagram at braver.man or email Pierre at bravermancoaching.com.
That's awesome, man. Hey, I want to take a moment and just say thank you for being on here.
Of
Thank you for
course.
sharing everything. I mean, the men's mental health side, definitely we need to start shedding more light on. I
Of
really
course.
hope that like you and me continue to work together and continue to figure out how we can put that out there. I really appreciate you being on. Thank
I,
you very, very much.
yeah, of course. Thank you, Shane. I appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you guys are safe out there in Florida.
Thank
Let
you.
us know if you need anything and how we can help. All right, man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
All right, thanks, brother.
Shane.
Take care.